She stood before the crowd, trembling beneath the weight of her own dress. It wasn't blood, nor blasphemy, nor murder that condemned her, it was silk. A forbidden shade, a foreign thread, a hemline stitched too high. To the judges, it wasn't fashion, it was rebellion. In the Dark and Middle Ages, the body was property, and appearance was law. What you wore announced who you were, who you served, and how much of your soul you owed. To step outside that order was to challenge God himself. The church called it vanity. The crown called it treason. The sentence was purification by whip, by fire, or by rope. But how did fabric become a symbol of sin? How did colors turn into crimes and dresses into death warrants? Beneath every law about modesty lay something darker. Fear. Fear of temptation, of status, of women who refused to be invisible. Tonight, we return to the centuries when appearance could kill, when beauty was forbidden, and when cloth itself carried judgment. Because in a world built on obedience, even the wrong thread could unravel an empire. Long before fashion became self-expression, it was a map of power. Every thread, every color, every fold of fabric told the world who you were and who you weren't allowed to be. In medieval Europe, this wasn't culture, it was control. Clothing was a social weapon sharpened by kings and sanctified by priests. The rulers called them sumptuary laws, codes written to preserve order, but designed to divide. These laws dictated what fabrics each class could wear, what colors were forbidden, and which ornaments marked a woman as sinful or pure. Velvet and silk were reserved for the nobility. Gold embroidery for the church. Bright dyes, especially crimson and scarlet, were considered indecent for unmarried women. To wear them without permission was to invite punishment. In Florence, violators were fined. In London, they were whipped. In parts of France and Spain, repeat offenders disappeared. At the surface, these laws were said to uphold morality. Beneath them, they preserved hierarchy. The church preached humility, but its bishops draped themselves in gilded robes. Women were told that modesty was godly, yet queens wore crowns heavy with jewels paid for by sermons on sin. The hypocrisy was divine. For women, fashion became a battlefield they could never win. To dress too richly was vanity. To dress too plainly was rebellion. To mimic nobility was deceit. To express beauty was temptation. The message was clear. Virtue was not in how she looked, it was in how she hid. The perfect woman was a blank canvas, a body erased by obedience. But not every woman accepted invisibility. As cities grew and merchants' wives began to gain wealth, women of the middle class started to imitate noble-style imported lace, foreign dyes, and fitted bodices that showed they could afford more than survival. To the ruling class, this imitation was treason. They believed the divine order depended on visible separation. A woman who dressed above her station was not simply vain, she was dangerous. She blurred the boundaries between classes and genders. She threatened to look powerful. The church soon stepped in, declaring clothing itself an instrument of the devil. Sermons across Europe warned that the devil enters through vanity, that painted lips and decorated gowns lured men into sin. The pulpit turned fashion into heresy. Preachers described women's garments as nets of Satan and threads of corruption. In some towns, tailors were required to report excessive measurements or lustful styles to local priests. A woman could be summoned for questioning simply because her sleeves were too wide or her neckline too daring. These laws went beyond modesty, they defined morality through fabric. A widow in mourning could wear black for 1 year, but if she continued after that, she was accused of false piety. A married woman could not wear red, for it suggested passion. Single women were forbidden to wear veils that concealed their faces because mystery itself was considered sin. Each rule was designed not to protect virtue, but to display submission. Records from Venetian moral courts revealed chilling cases. In 1357, a merchant wife was arrested for wearing a crimson gown, too similar to the Duchess. She was stripped in public and paraded through the market in a plain linen shift. In Milan, a widow was fined for displaying pearls while unwed. In Paris, women of lower birth caught wearing silk were branded as prostitutes, regardless of profession. The punishment was humiliation visible, intentional, and meant to teach obedience through fear. But why did appearance threaten power so deeply? Because identity was control. A woman's clothing announced her place in the divine order: daughter, wife, widow, or servant. To change her appearance was to change her destiny. It was an act of spiritual rebellion. A simple alteration of fabric became a declaration that she could define herself, not the church or crown. By the late 14th century, these rules extended even to fabric textures: linen for servants, wool for peasants, fur for nobles. The line between devotion and defiance was drawn in thread. Kings enforced these codes through proclamations, but priests enforced them through guilt. To wear what God did not assign, one bishop wrote, is to reject his will. The irony was inescapable. The same church that condemned vanity depended on spectacle. Cathedrals gleamed with gold, altars shone with embroidered vestments, holiness was woven with wealth. Women, however, were told that beauty invited evil. They became the scapegoats for society's obsession with temptation. The policing of appearance also served a political purpose. The growing independence of women, especially widows and merchants' wives, was unsettling to men of authority. Fashion became a convenient weapon to reassert control. Through laws, sermons, and punishments, male institutions reminded women that visibility was a privilege granted, not a right earned. And the punishment for defiance grew harsher. In parts of Spain and Germany, women were flogged for improper adornment. In Bohemia, repeat offenders were accused of witchcraft, their garments burned before execution. The church justified it by claiming they were purifying vanity through flame. Beneath all this moral theatre lay the true motive: fear. Fear of change, fear of women seen, fear of equality hidden beneath lace and colour. Society feared that if women could choose their clothes, they might start choosing everything else: their husbands, their faith, their lives. Clothing was never just cloth, it was a declaration of self in a world that demanded surrender. And when self-expression became sin, the body itself became evidence. The stage was set for a darker transformation. Soon, the laws of modesty would merge with laws of morality. The woman who dressed too boldly would no longer face fines or flogging, she would face fire. When the church looked at beauty, it did not see art, it saw danger. In the medieval mind, sin had texture, colour, and form, and nothing embodied temptation more vividly than the sight of a woman adorned. To the clergy, the painted face and the shimmering gown were not signs of confidence but of corruption. To decorate the body was to decorate sin itself. In sermons across Europe, priests warned that a woman dressed for the eyes of men has already undressed before God. The idea of purity became physical, sewn into veils, pressed into collars, stretched across bodies like cages. The wrong garment wasn't just immodest, it was heretical. A woman who dressed beyond her station was not merely vain, she was disobedient to divine hierarchy. This logic turned clothing into theology. In 13th century Paris, a bishop declared that Satan disguises himself in silk. In Venice, a decree banned the excessive shining of fabrics that corrupt the soul. And in England, religious courts punished women for tempting apparel, with public stripping, not because their bodies were unclean, but because the church claimed their beauty threatened the moral order. One chronicler described such a punishment in 1328, a young widow in Lincoln accused of inflaming hearts through vanity. Her crime? Wearing perfume and crimson sleeves, she was paraded through the market in a rough sackcloth robe, her hair shorn, her jewelry nailed to the church door as an offering to God. The crowd called it justice, the priests called it cleansing. The obsession with female appearance reached pathological extremes. The church's moral codes claimed to protect women's virtue, but in truth they revealed its fear of female desire and, worse, female power. To be admired was to wield influence, and influence was a man's domain, so admiration became sin and beauty became weaponized guilt. The theologians of the era argued that Eve's sin, the first sin, was not disobedience alone, but a lure. She saw, she desired, she tempted. Every woman, they said, carried that curse in her reflection. To cover herself was redemption, to reveal herself was rebellion. A woman's dress, then, was a battleground between heaven and hell. But even as the church condemned beauty, it profited from spectacle. Cathedrals blazed with stained glass, gold chalices reflected candlelight, and priests wore vestments woven from the very fabrics forbidden to women. The contradiction was blatant yet holy. The church claimed these adornments glorified God, while women's adornments glorified sin. It was during this hypocrisy that the idea of fashion as heresy took root. If modesty was obedience, then any deviation became blasphemy. A woman in rich colors challenged divine order. A widow who refused plain dress mocked the sanctity of mourning. A dancer who moved in bright silk was accused of embodying lust. And when accusations alone could no longer satisfy authority, punishment escalated to execution. In the late 14th century, several Italian city-states began imposing death penalties for repeat offenders of sumptuary laws. Women accused of habitual vanity could be tried before both civic and ecclesiastical judges. One Florentine decree stated, "Those who adorn the flesh beyond their birth shall forfeit life, for they adorn pride." Historical records show women hanged for wearing forbidden jewels or riding publicly in decorated gowns, acts seen as both moral provocation and class rebellion. The church encouraged these extremes through sermons that blended fear with fascination. Preachers spoke of women burning eternally in the garments they refused to remove. Paintings depicted damned souls drowning in rivers of melted gold, metaphors for vanity punished by its own desire. Parishioners left these sermons terrified yet mesmerized. The line between faith and voyeurism blurred. Even in daily life, the policing of clothing became ritualized humiliation. Parish inspectors, often called guardians of virtue, roamed towns with authority to reprimand unholy display. They could fine women for cosmetics, seize jewelry, or mark offenders with ash crosses on their foreheads. The same men who enforced piety often exploited it, taking bribes to overlook sins of fabrics or demanding confessions in private. The persecution was not always overt. Sometimes it was psychological. The church taught that beauty was a form of debt. To be beautiful was to owe restraint, to hide, to repent for the gift of appearance. Confessors instructed women to atone by fasting or wearing coarse garments. Some penitents wore hair shirts, spiked tunics that cut into their flesh with every movement, a practice meant to mortify vanity. A woman who once shimmered in silk now bled beneath wool. The cruelest irony was that these punishments often drew the same attention they claimed to prevent. Crowds gathered to watch shamed women paraded in rags, their humiliation feeding the same desires the church condemned. Public modesty became a form of spectacle. The system thrived on contradiction, suppressing what it secretly depended on. The most tragic cases involved those who used clothing not to tempt, but to survive. Courtesans, widows, and working women often wore bright fabrics to attract patrons or simply to be noticed in a world that ignored them. Yet the church saw no difference between survival and sin. To use beauty as a tool was to commit moral treason. In several cities, sex workers were marked with specific colors by law: yellow in Florence, red in Venice, branding them as eternal sinners. visible reminders of temptation's punishment. Still, there were women who resisted quietly. Some painted their faces in defiance, knowing it could mean death. Others smuggled forbidden dyes from foreign traders, weaving rebellion into their seams. A few noble women even wore men's cloaks to escape surveillance, crossing boundaries of gender and class. Each act of self-expression was a spark in the darkness, a reminder that even fear has limits. But for every spark, there was a pyre. In Germany, during the early 1500s, records show a young tailor's wife burned alive for mocking divine order. Her crime? Crafting dresses with necklines unfit for pious eyes. The church claimed her ashes would purify the city. Her death marked not the end of vanity, but the triumph of control. By turning appearance into sin, the church achieved something greater than submission. It redefined identity itself. Women stopped asking, "Who am I?" and started asking, "How do I appear?" Fear rewrote the self. The body became a confession. In a world ruled by men and sanctified by guilt, the simplest act, choosing what to wear, became an act of rebellion. And rebellion, under holy law, could only end one way. By the time the 15th century arrived, the church had already mastered the art of fear. But now it needed a face for its paranoia, and that face was a woman. The witch hunts did not begin with broomsticks or spells. They began with fabrics, perfumes, and colors. A woman's appearance became evidence of her soul. What she wore told the church what to burn. Silk was the first suspect. Imported, sensual, and shimmering, it embodied everything the church despised: luxury, pride, temptation. Women who wore silk were accused of calling spirits through vanity. Those who favored red or gold were said to cloak themselves in the devil's fire. Even perfume, once a symbol of cleanliness, was recast as a mark of seduction. To smell beautiful was to smell like sin. Records from the Germanic witch trials show dozens of women accused not for curses or potions, but for dress. One case from Würzburg described a merchant's widow whose wardrobe contained 3 red gowns of excessive finery. The inquisitors wrote, "She adorns herself beyond modesty and invites spirits through pride." She was found guilty not of sorcery, but of vanity, and executed as a witch. This was the era when theology fused with politics. The church and the state both feared women who didn't conform. In an age where social rank defined destiny, clothing blurred boundaries. A peasant dressed like a noblewoman threatened divine hierarchy. A noblewoman dressed too freely threatened patriarchal control. The church called it sin, the monarchy called it rebellion. Together they called it witchcraft. The obsession with women's clothing became a tool of surveillance. Inquisitors catalogued garments as if they were weapons. Trials listed silk girdles, crimson ribbons, forbidden veils as proof of demonic association. Judges examined corsets, slippers, and combs for enchanted threads. Even sewing needles were accused of being instruments of the devil. The female body, once draped in color and art, became a battlefield of morality. Behind these accusations was a deeper, unspoken fear, the fear of women who controlled their image. Clothing had always been language, and those who spoke it fluently wielded power. When a woman chose how to present herself, she declared ownership over her body, her social space, and her gaze. To the men of faith and authority, this was intolerable. They responded the only way power knows how, by branding freedom as evil. The transition from vanity to witchcraft was seamless. Sermons preached that women who cared too much for appearance charmed men with infernal allure. Inquisitors claimed that witches used garments woven by Satan's own hand. Even simple acts of self-expression became ritualized accusations. Wearing red meant lust. Wearing black meant mourning beyond God's will. Wearing green meant consorting with forest spirits. There was no safe color, no safe fabric, no safe identity. Fashion, once forbidden, now became fatal. The witch trials were not about magic, they were about control through symbolism. The garments burned with the bodies because they represented the same thing, autonomy. Each hemline, each thread, was a declaration of independence. The church called it blasphemy. History calls it terror disguised as faith. The politics of appearance also divided women from one another. The church encouraged conformity by weaponizing shame. Those who dressed modestly were praised as holy. Those who stood out were labeled fallen. Communities turned against themselves. Wives accused neighbors. Daughters testified against mothers. Fear of difference became survival. In Italy, inquisitors created lists of suspicious fashions, uncovered hair, embroidered collars, or foreign jewelry. In Spain, under the Inquisition, women were arrested for Jewish silks or Moorish dyes, evidence that clothing could betray one's faith even when words could not. Cultural identity became incriminating, and women paid the price for the colors of their ancestors. In Northern Europe, widows who refused to dress in mourning beyond a year were accused of defying divine grief. Some were even buried in rough cloth, their rich garments confiscated as satanic spoils. The church claimed their souls would ascend purer. The truth was simpler. Their possessions funded more witch hunts. For men, extravagance was ambition. For women, it was sin. The same silk that crowned kings condemned queens. Queen Anne Boleyn, centuries later, would be accused of witchcraft, partly because of her foreign clothing and unholy allure. Power and femininity, when combined, became heresy. But beneath every execution was something even more sinister: envy. The same priests who condemned female beauty secretly glorified it in art. Churches were filled with paintings of idealized women, saints with bare shoulders, Madonnas draped in blue silk. The contradiction was not lost on the artists who painted them, nor on the women who were punished for resembling them. The church punished real women for the fantasies it sanctified. The politics of female appearance also reflected the economy of power. Every garment a woman wore had to be approved, taxed, or condemned. Even death could not erase ownership. Witches' clothing was auctioned after execution, the proceeds divided between church and state. Each burning, each hanging became both a spectacle and a transaction. Faith and profit walked hand in hand, their steps measured by the screams of the condemned. And yet within this nightmare, rebellion found form in fabric. Some women wove secret patterns into their garments, symbols of resistance stitched into sleeves and hems, crosses reversed, flowers representing forbidden goddesses, initials of lost lovers or unborn daughters. These tiny acts of defiance survived the flames. Centuries later, archaeologists uncovered fragments of embroidered silk from execution sites' threads carrying silent messages across time. Even in death, the women refused erasure. Their fashion became memory, their color became legacy. What the church called heresy, history now calls art. But the witch hunts achieved their purpose. They erased choice. After generations of fear, women learned that safety lay in invisibility. They dressed in shadows, spoke in whispers, and lived within the narrow corridors of modesty. Beauty became burden. Expression became risk. The paradox is haunting. The more power women gained through adornment, the more violently society punished them for it. Clothing, the simplest form of identity, became a weapon, not just in the hands of those who wore it, but in the hands of those who used it to justify control. When a woman was accused of witchcraft, they burned her gown first, because even centuries ago they understood that power begins with how a woman chooses to be seen. When punishment becomes performance, justice dies, and in the Dark and Middle Ages, women's executions were theatre. Their deaths were staged as morality plays where each lash, flame, or chain carried a sermon. The message was simple: your body is not yours, and your appearance will betray you. The stage was usually a public square. Bells would toll, crowds would gather, and the condemned would be brought forth not naked, but stripped of meaning. Her garments, the supposed source of her sin, were torn, displayed, or burned before her eyes. Sometimes they were hung from church doors as trophies of purity reclaimed. The church called this purification. The crowd called it justice. Records from England describe how, in 1422, a woman named Cecily Thornton was executed for clothing herself in excess of her virtue. She had worn a blue silk gown the colour of the Virgin without permission. Before her hanging, her dress was set ablaze at her feet. The priest declared, "As the garment burns, so burns her vanity." The crowd applauded. Her crime was forgotten, but her lesson remained. In Venice, the punishment was more intricate. Women caught violating dress codes were paraded through the Piazza San Marco on donkeys, their hair shorn, their gowns replaced by rough linen. Musicians played solemn hymns, while priests chanted verses about Eve's sin. The procession wasn't about cleansing her, it was about displaying the power that condemned her. The humiliation was public, deliberate, and final. Every punishment had symbolism. The rope represented obedience restored, the flame, purity reborn, the whip, repentance earned. But beneath the theology was theatre, the spectacle of control disguised as faith. People came not to see justice, but to feel righteous. The screams of the accused reassured them that sin had been conquered for another day. In Spain, under the Inquisition, executions for vanity often accompanied witch burnings. A 1498 record from Toledo describes a woman who wore a gold-threaded shawl to mimic nobility. She was accused of witchcraft, condemned for blasphemy, and burned alongside her garments. The Inquisitor's final words: she defied her place in creation. Her ashes mixed with silk and smoke, the perfect union of sin and penance. The punishments were not always lethal. Some women were sentenced to perpetual penance, forced to wear coarse sackcloth or iron collars for the rest of their lives. One Venetian widow, accused of lustful attire, was made to sleep in a hair shirt until death. Her only sin was dressing well after her husband's passing. Society couldn't tolerate beauty without ownership. As the centuries passed, execution evolved into ritualized humiliation. Women accused of vanity were confined in chastity cages, iron frameworks shaped like corsets, pressing against their ribs, leaving bruises that turned into scars. These devices were designed not to kill, but to remind that the body was not a vessel of self, but a property of faith. Public interest in these punishments grew obsessive. Artists painted them. Poets described them as redemptive suffering. The church used them as propaganda. Manuals instructed local priests how to conduct processions of penance, detailing everything from the chants to the garments of the condemned. One instruction reads, "Let the linen be coarse, for her pride was smooth." Every act of punishment was choreographed like a liturgy. The executioners were often anonymous, but the spectators were not. The crowds were ordinary men and women, drawn not just by fear, but by fascination. They came to watch the forbidden unveiled, to see sin made visible. They told themselves they were defending morality, but they were consuming humiliation. The spectacle became addictive, a medieval version of entertainment where morality was currency and suffering was spectacle. The hypocrisy was unbearable. Men who punished women for vanity wore feathered hats and jeweled rings. Priests who condemned adornment wore gold crucifixes and robes embroidered with pearls. The same hands that stripped a woman's gown held gilded chalices at the altar. The church didn't destroy beauty, it monopolized it. Yet, despite the cruelty, the condemned often left behind moments of terrifying grace. Eyewitnesses recorded final words that silenced entire crowds. One accused woman, burned in Cologne in 1532, shouted before the flames rose, "My dress did not damn me, your fear did." The chronicler wrote that her words unnerved even the holy. But they did not stop the fire. The violence also served a social purpose. It reset order. Every execution reminded women of the cost of being seen. Daughters watched their mothers punished and learned to fold themselves smaller. Wives memorized the sermons and hid their laughter. Fashion disappeared into caution. The body became camouflage, but control is never permanent. The more the church tried to bury self-expression, the more fascination grew. Underground markets began selling forbidden dyes, secret tailors crafted hidden silks for noble women, and in quiet defiance, color began to return. A woman might wear her rebellion beneath her cloak, a crimson ribbon, a hidden embroidery, a thread of gold under plain cloth. Each tiny flourish whispered, "You do not own me." The executions slowed by the late 16th century, not because compassion prevailed, but because fear became self-sustaining. The church no longer needed flames to control women, guilt was enough. The doctrine of modesty had done its work. Women began to censor themselves, to look in mirrors and see sin. The spectacle had moved inward, yet the echoes never faded. Even centuries later, the memory of those punishments persisted in art, literature, and moral codes. The idea that a woman's clothing could invite judgment, violence, or shame survived the fires that were meant to extinguish it. Society stopped burning women, but it never stopped watching them. Every age has its public square. Every generation builds its stage for moral spectacle. The flames may have dimmed, but the eyes never closed. And when a woman was executed for her appearance, it wasn't her body they feared, it was her choice. Her right to define herself terrified them more than any heresy, because self-definition is the first step toward freedom. And freedom was the one sin the church could never forgive. Centuries have passed since the last woman was burned for a forbidden gown, but the trial never truly ended. The flames have turned to flashbulbs, the judges to commentators, the gallows to social media feeds. The setting changed, the ritual did not. Today, women no longer die for their dresses, they are destroyed for them in other ways. The world claims progress, but it still polices the same body, the same fabric, the same choice. A woman who reveals too much is asking for it. A woman who hides too much is repressed. The same double-edged sword of morality that once swung from the church's hand now hangs from the public tongue. The difference is visibility. Everyone is watching, and everyone believes they have the right to judge. In offices, dress codes still echo medieval modesty laws. Professional clothing often means desexualized, muted, safe, designed to erase individuality. In schools, girls are punished for distracting boys with bare shoulders, as if education must bow to desire. On streets, women are harassed for being too visible or too invisible, and online, millions of anonymous inquisitors enforce their own digital morality, dissecting every outfit, every photograph, every choice. The language changed, but the logic did not. The church once said, "Cover yourself to honor God." Society now says, "Dress appropriately to earn respect." Both sentences mean the same thing. Your worth depends on how much of yourself you conceal. The modern world replaced religious doctrine with social optics, yet the architecture of control remains intact. Even the symbols survived. The veil, once used to mark modesty, now divides cultures celebrated as faith in one place, condemned as oppression in another. The high heel, once a symbol of class and beauty, now becomes a test of professionalism. The same garments that empower one woman are used to shame another. Fashion remains a battlefield, but now the war is global. The industry that promises liberation often reproduces control. Magazines preach self-expression while selling conformity. Designers glorify rebellion but profit from predictability. The message hasn't changed, only the packaging. In medieval times, a priest decided what was pure. Today, an algorithm does. Both demand obedience, both punish deviation. Consider the modern spectacle, the red carpet, the runway, the viral photo. Cameras replace crowds. Each flash captures not the person, but the performance of identity. The applause sounds the same as the gasps of old. The spectacle of judgment has simply gone digital. We no longer light fires, we light up comment sections. We no longer burn bodies, we burn reputations. And beneath the glamour, the same question lingers. Who controls how a woman should appear? Religion, culture, commerce, or the silent collective that decides what's acceptable? The answer remains as fragmented as the reflections in a dressing room mirror. Each society chooses its fabric of control, modesty, freedom, tradition, fashion, but the stitching is always fear. In some parts of the world, women are still beaten for exposing their hair. In others, they are mocked for covering it. In one place, the law demands veils. In another, it bans them. Both claim to protect women. Both strip them of choice. The medieval logic persists, obedience disguised as virtue, punishment disguised as morality. Yet even within this control, women continue to reclaim the narrative. Each generation redefines the meaning of fabric, from rebellion to identity, from shame to art. When a woman wears color after grief, she resurrects defiance. When she chooses what to reveal or conceal, she performs an act of quiet revolution. Every outfit becomes a statement of ownership. I decide what this body means. The legacy of those who died for their dresses lives on in the courage of those who refuse silence. The woman who wore scarlet in defiance of priests, the girl who cut her hair short despite her father's warning, the artist who painted women as gods, not temptresses, the activist who wears her culture's garments in a world that calls them strange. Each one continues the rebellion that began with silk and fire. But freedom, like fashion, must be protected. The same systems that once hung women for vanity now sell empowerment as commodity. Be yourself, they say, but only if it sells. The market turns rebellion into trend, individuality into brand. What the church once censored, capitalism commercializes. The control simply changed hands. Still, the act of choice remained sacred. In the medieval square, a woman's color could condemn her. Today, it can define her. Each stitch of fabric worn freely is a denial of centuries of silence. Every woman who dresses for herself, not for approval, for fear, dismantles the system thread by thread. We remember the past not to romanticize it, but to recognize its reflection. The same eyes that once judged from cathedral balconies now stare from screens. The same impulse to purify through shame hides in hashtags and headlines. And the same strength that endured the fire still burns quieter, perhaps, but unyielding. History does not repeat. It reappears wearing different clothes. When you walk through a city today and see a woman dressed in confidence, understand what that image means. It is not vanity, it is victory. It is every silenced ancestor finally being seen, because they once burned women for their dresses. Now they only try to make them forget why they wore them. They wore.